Jordan, in my own view, which I've often stated, is that with a talented improvisation that nobody would have suspected, when the international left was defeated in the Cold War, they crowded aboard the environmental bandwagon, jostled aside the authentic ecologists, the bird watchers and the butterfly collectors, and these sincere, somewhat tedious groups like Greenpeace and Sierra and so on, and dressed themselves up as environmentalists to attack capitalism from a new angle in the name of saving the planet. And it was a genius, spontaneous strategy. But they've got more than they bargained for, because now they're really pitching, as you say, for the suicide of everybody, including the left. But and we're not all going to commit suicide, in my opinion, but I agree, it's as parlous as you described. But what I want to ask you is that how, in the scenario you described, and I certainly wouldn't take issue with it, where the government in this country, and no doubt others, attempts to regulate content and so forth on the internet, and they are outsmarted by the smartest people, easily outsmarted, because they are idiots as well as being debased people for the most part. Who wins the hearts and minds of the, to use Mr. Nixon's phrase, the silent majority of decent, sensible people? Because they're still there, no matter how deserved they are. Who wins?
Well, I've been working with a group of people in the UK, and we'll announce this sooner or later, and probably sooner rather than later, on trying to formulate an alternative vision. You know, because one of the things, you have to hand it to the radicals on the left. They're pretty damn good at appealing to the messianic urges of young people. And there's a developmental psychologist, Jean Piaget, who was a stage theorist, very influential developmental psychologist, and he regarded the last stage of cognitive moral development in human beings as the messianic stage. And hardly anybody talks about that element of his research, which, because it makes religious allusions, let's say, and we can't have that. And so, but what Piaget was pointing out was that among relatively intellectually and perhaps morally sophisticated young people at about the ages of, say, 17 to 21, about the time you really want to induct young men into the army if you want to do it effectively, because, you know, if you wait longer than that, it doesn't work very well. That's about between 16, 21, something like that. That's when young people catalyze their adult identities. I suspect most of you probably liked the music you listened to when you were 16 to 21 better than any other kind of music. That's a good example of that enculturation. In any case, young people who have a bit of intellectual capacity at that time are looking for something beyond themselves to devote themselves to. And some of that would be what drives their identification with their, in principle, their family and their community and their state and their nation, right? It's part of that drive that enables human beings to aggregate cooperatively and competitively within tribes. It's deeply rooted biological instinct. And the left has been unbelievably good at providing that impulse with a vision. And the vision is one of heroic defender of the individual against the oppressive patriarchy. That's a very old story, right? That's the hero who stands against the brute force of blind culture. It's an ancient story and a very motivating one. And if that's not enough for you, and perhaps it is, then you can be defender of the virginal planet from the rapers and pillagers, and that's where the capitalists fit in so nicely. And that's a pretty easy story to sell to young people who are looking for a mission. And it's got a quasi-religious element to it, which is deep, and so it fits in nicely to the slot that Christianity used to occupy, let's say. And so young people they fall into that by droves. Well, why? Well, it's because centrist liberals and conservatives, particularly conservatives, have done an absolutely abysmal job at formulating a counter-narrative of any potency. And conservatives, they tend to be more detail-oriented and practical, and so as visionaries, they're a lost cause, and that's part of what makes them conservative. I mean that temperamentally, because people who are more on the liberal side tend to be also people who are more imaginative and creative. On the conservative side, the moral advantage to conservatives is that they're practical, detail-oriented, orderly, industrious, patriotic, all of that. But that's not the same as visionary. And so they do a terrible job of selling tradition, let's say, to young people. It's usually in the form of finger wagging and, moral injunctions about how you should never do anything that's any fun. And that's just not, or anything that's particularly heroic. Anyways, we've been trying to formulate something that you might regard as a counter vision. And I can tell you some of the policies that we're pursuing, just so you know, and we'll make this broadly public sooner or later. So the first is on the energy front. It's like, you want to help the poor? Then make energy cheap. Period. You don't get to sacrifice the actual poor to the delusional poor of your delusional utopia 100 years from now. We did that a couple of times in the 20th century. Didn't work out very well. And so you can produce all the bloody renewables you want, and more power to you, but you can do that within the confines of a free market system, and you can do that by making them cost competitive, or you can get the hell out of the way. And so you might say, well, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative, and we already know this, is extremely expensive and unreliable energy sources that are at least equally as damaging to the ecosphere, and that certainly are expensive enough to drive the vast majority of people who are barely clinging to the edge of economic viability into abject poverty. And so enough of that. There's nothing you can say on that front that's moral. If your goal is to drive up energy prices, you're not going to save the planet, and you're going to kill maybe millions of people. If you really got your act together, you could probably kill hundreds of millions. I think the World Bank has already estimated that we've tapped something like 150 million people into near starvation conditions. And we could really get moving on that front if we keep mucking about. So the next thing to do, if we really want to be stupid, is to knock liquid natural gas availability in Europe off kilter badly enough, and maybe Putin will give us a hand with this, so that we can no longer produce ammonia fertilizer, because ammonia fertilizer feeds 4 billion people, and it's derived from natural gas. So that's policy one. Cheap energy. We can ameliorate absolute poverty with cheap energy, right, throughout the world. We have no right whatsoever in the colonial West to tell people in the developing world that they shouldn't be aspiring to standards of living like ours, to be able to heat their houses without choking on the fumes, to provide their children with rudimentary access to educational opportunities. We have no right whatsoever to say, you guys, you just stick with your bloody dung and your wood. You don't get liquid natural gas or coal or any of the things that we use to elevate ourselves out of freezing in the dark. So that's policy one. Policy two is something approximating a multifactorial environmental vision. It's like, why did we all decide in a fit of stupidity the only thing we had to worry about on the environmental front was an excess of carbon? It's like we're going to take a multifactorial problem, because there are environmental problems, and we're going to reduce it to one thing. I don't know how many of you know this. Maybe you could clap again. Do you know, how many of you know, let's do this. How many of you think the world has less vegetation in it than it did 15 years ago? How many of you think that? Come on, admit it. Okay, so how many of you know that the planet is actually 15% greener than it was in the year 2000? Oh, you do? Okay. How many of you know that that's a direct consequence of carbon dioxide production? Okay. How many of you know, this is what's really comical, how many of you know that most of that greening has occurred in the semi-arid areas that were supposed to turn into desert? Yeah, right. So, we could, very funny. Yeah, right. Fossil future with Alex Epstein, yeah. So we could produce an intelligent environment environmental policy that would be something like, well, we need to develop a vision that takes the necessity for human economic development into account and makes it primary. So the goal would be more for everyone, including our children, in a way that is as efficient and clean, whatever that means, as possible. That's fine. There are sophisticated people working on such visions. Bjorn Lomborg is a great one. I like Alec Epstein a lot. Michael Schellenberger is reliable. Marian Tupy, the Cato Institute, he knows what he's talking about. These are people who have a vision of a planet where there's more than enough for everyone, and that's within our grasp. That is definitely within our grasp. If we wanted that, we could obliterate, we're already doing a pretty good job on that front, as it turns out, but we could obliterate absolute poverty for sure in 15 years. And we also know, and this is so cool, and one of the things that shocked me when I first started to look into this, so imagine you do want a more sustainable planet. Okay, fair enough. Do you want poor people on that planet, or do you want rich people on the planet? Well, it turns out if you can get people's income up to $5,000 per year on a GDP basis, they immediately start taking a long-term view. Well, why? Well, how about because they're not scrabbling around in the dirt trying to figure out where the hell lunch is coming from, right? They can start thinking about the beauty of the local environment and the possibility that something attractive could be maintained for their children and grandchildren who are likely to live to see it. And so there's a very strong positive correlation between environmental sensitivity and wealth. And so I found that out about 10 years ago. I thought, well, doesn't that mean we could have our cake and eat it too? We could work diligently to ameliorate absolute poverty around the world by driving energy costs down to as close to zero as possible. We could make everyone rich in terms of their local standards of living and the opportunities they have for their kids, and we could make the planet better off. Well, why wouldn't you want that? And the answer is, the planet has too many people on it anyways. And so, I can't overstretch how deadly the anti-humanism at the bottom of that sentiment truly is. It's pathological beyond comprehension. So there's two more. I'll go over them very quickly. This is the toughest pill to swallow, but perhaps not for those of you in the audience. I spent a lot of time in Hungary recently, and I know that's all fascists and Nazis, but I met with the president of Hungary, who I liked very much, Katalin Novaks, and she was one of the spearheaders of the Hungarian family policy, and they spend 6% of their GDP on family support. And not in a socialist way, let's say. So how do you do that? Well, here's what they do in Hungary. If you're a married woman in Hungary and you have a child, you are now exempt from 25% of state income tax for the rest of your life. 50% with 2 kids, 75% with 3, and with 4 kids, you never pay a cent of income tax again in the rest of your life. And so, yeah, and so I thought, well, that's cool. The feminists must be celebrating that like mad all across Western Europe. And of course, their response is, you're just trying to turn women into baby-making machines. It's like, hey, I thought what you guys wanted for the last 300 years was for a society to become sophisticated enough to monetize the disproportionate female contribution to reproduction. That's kind of like the core dream of the genuine feminist. It truly is, right? Because you could say, I mean, with some degree of accuracy, that women bear a disproportionate cost for reproduction. What is a woman? A woman is the sex that bears the disproportionate cost for reproduction. And that's even biologically true. It's biologically true. And so this is a lovely solution. And so the Hungarians have, with their family support policies, which are much more extensive than that which I just laid out, they've cut the abortion rate by 40% in 10 years. It's still legal, and they did it without compulsion. So that's, unless you're the sort of person to get your sister an abortion as a Christmas present, you might think that that's actually a very positive move forward, right? Because who the hell thinks that's a good thing? You might think it should be legal and you might think it should be available, but there's really something wrong with you if you think it's good. And so to cut it by 38%, which is what they've done, that's quite the stellar accomplishment. They've also simultaneously increased female work participation by 13%. So not only have they freed women from the onerous burden of excess taxation, but they've increased the number of women who are participating in the labor force. It's like, what the hell's wrong with that? So one of the policies we're going to put forward is unabashed support, and I think the psychological literature bears me out on this. We know perfectly well that the minimum viable domestic unit for the nurturing of healthy children is a man and a woman. Now, maybe 2 adults could substitute for that, conceivably, but when you bring it down to 1, you're pushing your damn luck. It's too complicated to raise children. You can't do it optimally with one person. Some people struggle mightily and sort of manage it, but it's not an ideal and it's not optimal. And fatherlessness, I'll tell you a couple of things about fatherlessness. If you're a 12-year-old boy and you don't have a father, the telomeres on the end of your chromosomes are already 10 to 12% shorter. That means you will already die sooner, because telomere length is one of the things that predicts lifespan. And so we don't know why. It probably has something to do with some poorly understood relationship between chronic stress and chromosomal health. No one knows why. If you're a female and you don't have a father, you hit puberty at least 1 year earlier. And nobody knows why that is either. And that's not good, right? You don't want your 8-year-old hitting puberty. She's not ready for it. And the probability that that's the case is much higher if she doesn't have a father in the house. And we know that fatherlessness is associated with a catastrophic cavalcade of developmental problems. And so it's time for conservatives and centrist liberal types to say, look, we got to be tolerant. Every family that you've ever met has its problems. Nobody lives up to the ideal of long-term, faithful, loving, peaceful, productive, generous, heterosexual monogamy. Like, it's an impossible ideal, right? You're going to fight with your wife, even if you stay with her, and you're not always going to be happy, that's for sure. And probably you have divorced people in your family, you know. Maybe there's a gay guy or 2 in the woodpile, who knows? And so we need to tolerate the fringes, let's say, because we're all imperfect, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't celebrate the ideal. And we got to stop being like half-witted and cowardly about this and do it forthrightly. So